Have you ever found yourself wondering about the real complexities behind drug use,
hmm
especially, how it plays out in different communities?
Yeah, or maybe how our own understanding might be a bit skewed. Maybe shaped more by, well, assumptions than actual data.
Exactly. It's so easy to look at surface numbers and just jump to conclusions, isn't it?
It really is. But the reality, particularly with something as sensitive as substance use, it's almost always far more nuanced.
And those nuances are absolutely key to grasp.
Definitely.
So, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're getting into some really fascinating new research. It looks at non-opiate substance use and treatment services, specifically within minority ethnic communities.
hmm
Our mission today is to really unpack this 18-month project, maybe challenge some common ideas, and see what practical insights we can pull out.
Yeah, and it's quite a comprehensive piece of work. The researchers, they drew from a real mix of sources. They
Okay.
started with a big literature review,
Yeah.
looking at 25 existing papers. Then they dove into national survey data,
Which ones?
specifically the Adults Psychiatric Morbidity Survey, using data from 2007 and 2014, and also the Crime Survey for England and Wales, the 2019-2020 data.
Right. So big data sets.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just numbers, was it?
No, and this is crucial. They complemented that with lived experiences. So 24 in-depth interviews with people who've actually faced problematic drug use.
And professionals too?
Yes, and 14 interviews with professionals working right there in the field.
Okay, now before we dive too deep, there's an important disclaimer from the researchers we should mention.
Yeah, that's right. They sometimes had to group certain ethnic categories together, for consistency or just because sample sizes were small in places.
Which means?
Well, I mean, some of those initial stats might be less granular than you'd ideally want.
Okay. And what about reporting?
There's always a possibility of some underreporting, especially since, in the crime survey, minority ethnic groups were actually more likely to decline answering the drug use questions compared to the white British population.
That's a really important point of context.
It absolutely is, and it underlines that these figures, they should never, ever be taken as stereotypes based on ethnicity.
Right. They're a starting point, an overall picture.
Exactly. An overall picture, a place to start understanding, but definitely not a label for any group.
Okay, got it. So with that context, let's look at the big picture first. What did that initial survey data suggest about drug use across different groups?
Yeah.
The prevalence numbers.
Well, the initial findings, they did show variation. Past year drug use varied quite significantly when comparing minority ethnic groups to the white British population.
How so?
For example, the crime survey for England and Wales, that showed the highest prevalence among mixed or other ethnic populations.
Okay.
But then the adult psychiatric morbidity survey, that pointed to the highest prevalence among black ethnic populations.
Interesting. So slightly different top groups depending on the survey. Was there any consistent finding, though?
There was, yeah. Both data sets consistently showed the lowest past year drug use among the Asian community.
Okay. And what about the substances themselves? Any common threads there?
Yeah, across the whole sample, cannabis was the most common, then followed by cocaine and ecstasy.
Right. So we have these initial variations, but then the research really started digging deeper, didn't it?
It did.
What was the really big aha moment when they started controlling for other factors?
This is where it gets really fascinating. The crucial finding was this. Ethnicity itself wasn't the key driver.
Really?
Yeah. When they controlled for other things, basically, comparing people from similar backgrounds, similar life stages,
Like what sort of things?
like age, education level, employment status, and importantly, the index of multiple deprivation, which is about access to resources, opportunities in their local area.
Okay, so when they level the playing field socioeconomically.
Exactly. When they did that, the black and mixed other ethnic groups were actually no longer significantly different from the white British group in terms of past year drug use.
Wow, okay. That completely reframes the discussion.
It really does.
It challenges so many sort of baked-in assumptions. So those initial differences weren't primarily about someone's ethnicity at all.
Precisely. The strongest predictors that did explain those differences were, firstly, age, that was a main predictor, explained some variations,
Okay.
and crucially, deprivation and poverty. Poverty was a particularly strong predictor, especially in explaining the differences seen for the black group compared to the white British group.
That really underscores it then. If we want to understand drug use patterns, we have to look beyond race.
Absolutely. It pushes us towards broader socioeconomic factors.
That's a really powerful insight. And it leads us nicely into the qualitative side of the research, the interviews. beyond the stats, what were the deeper drivers? What did people say? Let's maybe start with social influences.
Yeah, okay. The interviews, they showed that spending time with peers who used drugs, often during teenage years, was a significant starting point for many.
Right, the classic peer pressure idea.
Well, what's interesting is the language people used. It wasn't so much described as explicit peer pressure. It was more about a desire to fit in, being part of the group, more of a social pull.
A pull rather than a push. Okay, and gender came into it too.
For some, yes, drug use was sometimes linked to perceptions of masculinity, like a way to prove they were real men.
Hmm.
And then there was this surprising finding for some individuals who were in mostly white British peer groups.
What was that?
For them, drug use was sometimes seen as a chance to sort of explore substances not accepted within their own communities.
Interesting. And what about the flip side? Cultural acceptance or non-acceptance within their own community?
That was complex, almost paradoxical, really.
Yeah.
While some were drawn to substances maybe more accepted in their specific communities,
Uh-huh.
for others, the strong non-acceptance of certain drugs by their family or community that actually ignited their curiosity, it became a main driver.
Wow, so the taboo itself could be the draw.
Mm.
It really shows how personal and culturally specific these things are.
Absolutely, deeply personal.
Okay, so beyond social circles, what about resources and access? How did deprivation link in? You said it was complex earlier.
It was definitely a double-edged sword. For some, drug use was clearly a way to coping with stress, depression from maybe unemployment, or just extreme poverty.
Right, a coping mechanism.
But for others, not having money was actually a reason to cut down or stop using, or maybe only use if friends offered it.
Okay.
And then conversely, finding a job or suddenly having more disposable income, that could lead some people to actually increase their drug use just because they had greater access.
So definitely not a simple cause and effect there. And what about just plain availability? How
Yeah.
easy was it to get drugs? I remember a quote that really stood out.
Oh, incredibly easy, according to participants. One person put it very vividly. Buying drugs in my area, it's easier to call in for a Uber or ordering food on delivery.
Wow. That really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. How readily available things are locally is a huge driver.
Yeah, that quote really drives home the availability issue. And it makes you think about bigger policy decisions, too, and their effects. Like the cot ban in 2014. What did the research find about that?
Ah, yes, the cot ban. It's a really powerful example of, well, unintended consequences of policy.
How so?
So after the ban, fresh khat, which is a mild stimulant plant, traditionally chewed in some communities for socializing, relaxation, it became really hard to find.
Right.
But crucially, this didn't stop substance use altogether. Instead, as participants described it, it pushed people towards other substances,
Like what?
notably alcohol and nitrous oxide, laughing gas. So it just shows the complexity reducing access to one thing without addressing the underlying reasons for use or the cultural context. It can just shift the problem elsewhere.
That insight about policy impact, it sort of leads us naturally to another really critical layer the research looked at. Something often deeply tangled up with substance use. Mental health.
Absolutely.
What did they find there?
A very strong and very complex relationship across all ethnic groups, actually. Participants often talked about using drugs as a way to cope.
Coping with what specifically?
Things like stress, anxiety, trauma, depression. Sometimes these issues stemmed from recent life changes, losing a job, money problems. Other times from past experiences, like instances of child sexual abuse were mentioned.
And did the research find any extra layers to this for minority ethnic communities specifically?
Yes, it did. On top of those general mental health links, you often saw added layers of, say, isolation, discrimination, or social exclusion, often stemming from racism.
Right.
There was a particularly powerful example of intersectionality, a gay man from a minority ethnic background. He faced discrimination both from wider society because of his ethnicity and also within his own family or community because of his sexual orientation.
That's incredibly tough.
Yeah. And for him, drug use became a coping strategy. But then, because drug use itself was also highly stigmatized in his community, it just added, in his words, an extra layer of stress because he had to hide that too.
And it works both ways, doesn't it? Drug use can start as coping, but then worsen mental health.
Exactly. Participants reported things like paranoia, even psychoses, either starting or getting much worse because of their drug use.
So it can become this vicious cycle.
Absolutely. A really complex, reinforcing cycle. It's tough stuff to hear, but so important to acknowledge.
It really is. So when people are caught in this complex web of issues, substance use, mental health challenges, maybe social pressures, Why don't more people seek help? What did the research identify as the main barriers to getting treatment and support?
Well, a huge one, probably the primary one, is stigma. Just overwhelming stigma, shame, and fear of judgment.
Leading people to hide it.
Exactly,
Like,
leading to concealment of drug use, and this was particularly linked to cultural or religious attitudes. It came up as a really significant barrier, especially for minority ethnic women. They feared being judged, maybe even ostracized by their community if their drug use became known.
wow. And beyond that personal fear, was there also just a lack of awareness about where to even go?
Yes, absolutely. Many people simply said they did not know where to look for help.
Hmm.
This seemed to be more of an issue for first-generation immigrants, perhaps understandably, due to just being less familiar with navigating the UK healthcare system.
And trust. Was trust in services an issue?
A big one.
Yeah.
A significant lack of trust, often stemming from past negative experiences, either their own or hearing about others' experiences with healthcare. That included experiences of racism or just feeling completely misunderstood by professionals.
Okay. And confidentiality concerns.
Huge concerns about confidentiality, especially for people like asylum seekers or mothers. They worried about community judgment, yes, but also potential involvement of law enforcement or social services if they disclose their drug use.
It sounds like the services themselves, in terms of cultural appropriateness, also played a part.
Definitely. People talked about a perceived lack of diversity among staff at treatment centers. That put some people off.
They wanted to see people like them.
Yeah, people often said they'd prefer to speak with someone from a similar background, whether that's ethnicity, religion, or crucially lived experience of similar issues. And minority ethnic women often specifically said they preferred female staff.
And language barriers.
Yes, that came up too. Support materials weren't always available in different languages. And even when interpreters were provided, participants sometimes felt they weren't fully effective, which really limited how much people could engage with the service.
You know, earlier you mentioned how, for some, drug use was seen as normal within their community. Did that act as a barrier too?
It did, yeah. For some groups, particularly some Black Caribbean participants, cannabis use was described as considered very normalized.
So not seen as a problem needing treatment.
Exactly, not seen as problematic, and that itself acted as a significant barrier to seeking help, often until things reached a real crisis point.
Right. And finally, what about money? Financial hurdles.
They were definitely present. Even though free services exist, there was sometimes a wariness about their quality. This led to a perception, particularly among some younger minority ethnic individuals, that you really needed private care, which is often prohibitively expensive to get high-quality support.
Okay, so a whole range of really significant barriers there. Given all that, what does the research actually recommend? How do we chart a path forward? What can be done to build that knowledge and trust?
Well, the recommendations focus on a few key areas. One is creating multilingual support materials, leaflets, websites, whatever, and crucially distributing them where people actually are.
Like where?
Like community centers, places of worship, places people already gather and feel comfortable.
Makes sense.
There's also a strong emphasis on effective outreach work, building partnerships with organizations that are already embedded and trusted within communities, and working closely with GPs as they're often the first point of contact for health concerns.
And what about engaging community leaders?
Absolutely crucial. Fostering relationships with respected community or religious representatives, they can be key allies in increasing trust and also addressing misconceptions about services or addiction itself.
Okay, that's about building trust. What about delivering services that are genuinely culturally appropriate? How do we do that?
Services really need to think about the lived experience and diversity of their own staff and volunteers. That's vital.
So more diverse staff.
Yes, but also it requires resources for proper staff training. Training so staff can truly understand the specific needs of the local communities they serve and deliver support that is sensitive and genuinely tailored.
It's not one size fits all.
Not at all. It's about giving service users real choice and flexibility in the support they receive, recognizing that people's needs vary hugely. And again, partnership working is key here, partnering with existing specialist organizations, because no single service can possibly meet every diverse need.
Right, and we think back to that connection with mental health, housing, employment. Drug use rarely happens in a vacuum, does it?
Exactly. So the treatment approach needs to be holistic, what the report calls wraparound support,
Meaning
addressing all those co-occurring issues alongside the substance. Use mental health, physical health, housing problems, employment support. Often this means multiple services collaborating effectively around one person.
And making it easy to access.
Absolutely critical. Given all those extra barriers that people from minority ethnic backgrounds might face, services need to be as easy to access and as responsive as possible.
So think about practical things.
Yeah, practical things like opening times, minimizing waiting lists, being flexible with appointments, thinking about location, even the mode of delivery online, in person, etc., making it work for people's lives.
Okay. And finally, looking ahead, the research also points to areas needing more investigation, doesn't it? Future research directions. What stands out there?
A really key one is understanding the experiences of affected others.
You mean family, carers?
Exactly. Loved ones, carers. Because substance use, it never just impacts the individual, does it? It sends ripples through families and communities. Their perspective is vital if we want to create better support systems for everyone involved.
That's incredibly important, often overlooked. What else did they highlight?
They also pointed to a need to explore examples of good practice, particularly around early intervention and aftercare areas that often don't get enough focus.
Okay.
And digging deeper into those intersectional challenges, like how does asylum status interact with these issues, or sexual orientation? Because people's lives aren't just one dimension.
And this comes back to avoiding generalizations based only on ethnicity.
Precisely. The research strongly warns against that. We always need to consider those broader factors alongside ethnicity, things like age, gender, deprivation level, migration history. They all play a part.
So where could research go next, practically?
Well, future work could look at people's long-term journeys with substance use, maybe conduct similar studies in other parts of the UK, like Scotland, to see if the findings hold. And importantly, research what service providers actually need, what resources, what training to put these recommendations into practice effectively.
It's not just about knowing what to do, but how to enable it.
Exactly. And it's worth mentioning there's already a parallel study underway looking specifically at opiates and crack cocaine, plus findings from other related studies, like one on alcohol use among South Asian women. They show similar themes emerging, especially around barriers like stigma.
So common threads across different substances and groups, it really is a complex, ongoing picture.
It certainly is.
So we've just taken quite a journey through this research, really digging into the complex world of non-opiate drug use within minority ethnic communities. We've seen how that initial data, well, it can be quite misleading if you don't look deeper.
Yeah, definitely.
And how social influences, access, deprivation, how they really shape people's experiences. And of course, those huge, multifaceted barriers people face just trying to get culturally sensitive support.
Yeah, this research, it really hammers home that there's no single story here, no easy answer.
Yeah.
And if you connect it to the bigger picture, it raises a really important question for all of us, doesn't it? In this world where we're drowning in information, how do we make sure our systems, whether that's healthcare, policy, community support, how do we ensure they move beyond those broad, sometimes inaccurate generalizations?
And
Instead, truly understand and respond to the unique individual human experiences that sit behind all that data.
That's the challenge. So thinking about everything we've discussed, what stands out to you, our listener, as the most critical step we need to take towards achieving that truly tailored and effective